The morning of January 10th, 1943, somewhere in the dense jungle northwest of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a Japanese artillery observer named Lieutenant Koji Tanaka crouched in his camouflaged observation post and watched something impossible unfold before his eyes. At precisely 0645 hours, without warning, without ranging shots, without the telltale adjustment fire that every artillery officer in the world knew must precede accurate bombardment, the entire ridgeline he had been observing simply exploded. Not in sequence. Not with the distinctive pattern of shells walking toward a target, all at once. Dozens of American shells, fired from batteries positioned miles apart in different directions, struck within a span of seconds so brief that the sound merged into a single catastrophic roar. Tanaka had trained at the Imperial Army Artillery School at Chiba. He had studied German and French artillery doctrine. He had fought in China for 2 years, coordinating fire missions with the precision that came from careful observation and methodical adjustment. What he had just witnessed violated every principle of artillery science he had learned. The Americans had destroyed a Japanese infantry company without firing a single adjustment round. They had coordinated batteries from different positions, different distances, different angles of fire, and brought all those shells to the same point in space at the same moment in time. It was, by every calculation Tanaka could make, impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Americans called it time on target. The Japanese would come to call it something else entirely, proof that they were fighting an enemy whose industrial and technical capabilities exceeded anything their military planners had imagined possible. This is the story of how Japanese commanders, trained in a doctrine that emphasized individual soldier spirit over material resources, encountered an artillery system so sophisticated that it seemed to defy the laws of warfare itself. It is a story about the collision between two entirely different philosophies of war, and about the terrible moment when belief meets reality. To understand why American artillery seemed impossible to Japanese commanders, you must first understand what artillery meant in the Imperial Japanese Army's way of war. The Japanese approach to artillery was not the result of ignorance or incompetence. It was the product of deliberate strategic choices shaped by decades of military experience and constrained by Japan's industrial limitations. Japanese artillery doctrine in 1943 emphasized the primacy of the infantry soldier above all else. This was not romantic nonsense about samurai spirit, though that rhetoric certainly existed. It was a calculated response to Japan's strategic situation. The nation simply did not have the industrial capacity to match Western powers in the production of heavy artillery, ammunition, and the complex logistics required to sustain massive bombardments. So Japanese military theorists, educated at institutions like the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and influenced by German and French instructors from the late 19th century, developed a doctrine that worked within these constraints. Japanese artillery was designed to support aggressive infantry action, not to serve as the primary killing arm. Field artillery regiments attached to divisions typically consisted of 36 Type 94 75mm guns, or 36 Type 91 105mm howitzers. These were capable weapons, well made, with effective ranges and reasonable accuracy. But the Japanese used them differently than their American counterparts would. Japanese doctrine emphasized what they called aimed fire, or point fire, rather than area bombardment. Each battery operated semi-independently, assigned to support specific infantry battalions. Fire direction was decentralized. Individual battery commanders identified targets in their sectors, calculated firing data, and engaged those targets independently. There was no centralized fire direction center coordinating multiple batteries. There was no doctrine for rapidly massing the fires of entire battalions or regiments on a single point. This approach had its logic. It conserved ammunition, a critical consideration for an island nation whose supply lines were increasingly threatened by American submarines. It emphasized the careful registration of targets through observed fire. Japanese artillery officers would methodically adjust their fire, walking rounds onto a target through patient observation and correction, ensuring accuracy before firing for effect. This was sound gunnery practice, the kind taught at artillery schools around the world since the late 19th century. The problem was that this methodical approach required time. A Japanese battery engaging a new target would fire ranging shots, observe the fall of shot, calculate corrections, fire again, observe again, adjust again. Only after achieving satisfactory accuracy would they fire for effect. This process might take 10 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes longer depending on visibility and terrain. During this time, enemy troops could observe where the rounds were landing, identify the likely target, and take cover or move equipment. Japanese liaison between infantry and artillery units was often poor. Infantry commanders, steeped in a doctrine that emphasized the primacy of the rifle and bayonet, sometimes viewed artillery support as secondary to the aggressive spirit of their soldiers. They would often attempt to dictate how artillery should be employed, rather than allowing artillery officers to use their technical expertise. This created friction and reduced the effectiveness of fire support. Moreover, Japanese artillery units operated with limited ammunition supplies. The logistical challenge of moving shells through jungle terrain, across vast ocean distances, and to forward positions on contested islands meant that artillery officers had to be conservative with their fire. They could not afford the kind of massive preparatory bombardments that characterized American or Soviet artillery practice. They fired carefully, slowly, methodically. There was another critical limitation: communication. Most Japanese artillery battalions had radios only at battalion headquarters. Individual batteries communicated with their forward observers through telephone wire, laid across jungle terrain where it was constantly cut by movement, by enemy action, by falling trees, by rain and mud. When wire communication failed, as it frequently did, observers had to resort to visual signals or runners. This made rapid response to changing tactical situations nearly impossible. Japanese officers were aware of these limitations. They were not naive about the material advantages their enemies possessed, but they believed, with some justification based on their experiences in China and in the early Pacific campaigns, that aggressive infantry tactics could compensate. Japanese night attacks, infiltration tactics, and the willingness of soldiers to close with the enemy in hand-to-hand combat had achieved remarkable successes against Chinese forces and against unprepared Allied units in Malaya and the Philippines. The assumption underlying Japanese doctrine was that artillery existed to support the decisive action of infantry. The infantryman, with his rifle and bayonet, would win battles. Artillery provided supporting fire, suppressing enemy positions while Japanese soldiers closed to assault range. It was a doctrine built around the limitations and strengths of the Imperial Japanese Army as it existed in the 1930s and early 1940s. What Japanese commanders did not fully appreciate, because they had never encountered it, was what happened when you faced an enemy whose artillery was not a supporting arm, but the primary killing weapon. An enemy who could coordinate dozens of batteries across vast distances. An enemy who could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on any point on the battlefield within minutes, without warning, without the telltale adjustment fire that gave defenders time to prepare. An enemy who treated ammunition not as a scarce resource to be carefully conserved, but as an industrial product to be expended by the thousands of rounds to achieve tactical objectives. The Japanese artillery system was designed for the war Japan expected to fight. It was about to encounter the war America had prepared to wage. While Japanese artillery doctrine emphasized decentralized control and methodical aimed fire, The United States Army had been quietly revolutionizing the science of artillery control since the 1930s. Revolution began not on a battlefield, but at the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the minds of a handful of innovative officers who recognized that artillery could be transformed from a supporting arm into a devastating primary weapon system. The key figure was Major Carlos Brewer, who served as director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Brewer was troubled by a fundamental problem in artillery practice: how to rapidly mass the fires of multiple batteries on a single target. Traditional methods required each battery to register on a target independently, firing adjustment rounds to determine the correct firing data. This took time and coordination, and it telegraphed your intentions to the enemy. Brewer and his successor, Major Orlando Ward, developed something called a Fire Direction Center, or FDC. The concept was elegantly simple, but revolutionary in its implications. Instead of each battery calculating its own firing data independently, all the batteries in a battalion or even a regiment would send their survey data to a centralized location. There, a team of specialists would calculate firing data for all the guns simultaneously, using common survey control and meteorological data. This meant that multiple batteries, positioned miles apart, could engage the same target using coordinated firing data calculated from a single source. The Fire Direction Center did more than centralize calculations. It fundamentally changed how artillery could be employed. With an FDC, a forward observer could identify a target and call for fire using grid coordinates from a map. The FDC would receive those coordinates, plot them, calculate the data for every available gun within range, and have multiple batteries fire on that target within minutes. No adjustment fire necessary. No telling the enemy what you were about to hit. But the real innovation came with something called time-on-target firing. The principle was devastatingly simple. Shells fired from different distances take different amounts of time to reach the target. A battery positioned beginning 2 miles from a target will have shells that take less time to impact than a battery positioned 5 miles away. Traditionally, this meant that the closer battery's shells would arrive first, giving the enemy warning. American artillerymen realized they could reverse the firing sequence. The batteries farthest from the target would fire first. Then batteries at intermediate ranges would fire, timed so that their shells would be in flight while the distant rounds were still arcing through the sky. Finally, the closest batteries would fire last. If calculated correctly, all the shells, despite traveling different distances at different trajectories, would arrive at the target within a span of a few seconds. The effect on troops in the target area was catastrophic. There was no warning. No adjustment fire walking toward their position. No time to take cover or move equipment. Just sudden, overwhelming devastation as dozens or even hundreds of shells arrived simultaneously from multiple directions. American testing in the 1970s would later confirm what combat experience had already demonstrated. In the first few seconds of an artillery bombardment, before troops could take cover, casualties were 2 to 3 times higher than after soldiers went prone or found protection. Time on target eliminated those first few seconds of warning. Every shell in the fire mission arrived during that critical window when troops were still exposed. The technique was tested and refined at Fort Sill throughout the 1930s. By the time America entered World War II, fire direction centers and time-on-target tactics were doctrine, taught to every artillery officer, practiced by every battery. The system required several critical components. First, accurate maps with standardized grid systems. American military cartographers produced detailed maps of combat zones, with each map divided into numbered grid squares. A forward observer could identify any point on the battlefield by its grid coordinates, allowing the FDC to plot targets precisely without ever seeing them. Second, accurate survey control. Every artillery position had to be precisely located and its relationship to other batteries established through careful surveying. American artillery units included dedicated survey teams who would establish control points and ensure that all guns in a battalion knew their exact positions relative to each other and to the map grid. Third, meteorological data. Wind speed, wind direction, air temperature, and air density all affected the flight of artillery shells. American artillery units had weather teams who would launch small balloons, track them with instruments, and calculate the atmospheric conditions affecting shell flight. This data was provided to the FDC, which incorporated it into firing calculations. Fourth, radio communication. Every American artillery battery had radio equipment. Forward observers had radios. Battalion and regimental headquarters had radios. This meant that fire missions could be called in, calculated, and executed within minutes, sometimes faster. There was no reliance on telephone wire that could be cut, no need for runners or visual signals. Fifth, ammunition in quantities that seemed almost incomprehensible to armies operating under resource constraints. American industrial production meant that artillery battalions in the Pacific could fire hundreds, sometimes thousands of rounds in a single day without worrying about exhausting their stocks. Supply ships brought more ammunition. American artillery officers were trained to expend ammunition freely to save lives. Japanese artillery officers were trained to conserve ammunition because there might not be more. The first time on-target fire mission conducted in combat was fired by the 25th Infantry Division under Major General J. Lawton Collins on Guadalcanal in January 1943. 6 field artillery battalions participated, coordinating their fire through a division-level fire direction center. The target was a Japanese position known as Galloping Horse. At the designated time, all 6 battalions fired in sequence, with the most distant batteries firing first and the closest batteries firing last. Soldiers advancing through the target area afterward found Japanese positions devastated, with equipment destroyed and casualties scattered across the killing zone. Many Japanese soldiers appear to have been caught in the open, having had no time to seek cover. This was what Lieutenant Tanaka had witnessed that morning in January. This was the impossible thing that violated everything he understood about artillery. He had no way of knowing that what seemed impossible was simply the application of industrial-scale organization, precise calculation, and abundant resources to the ancient art of hurling projectiles at the enemy. He only knew that the Americans could do something his own artillery could not replicate, something that seemed to violate the fundamental rules of warfare as he understood them. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders would prove as devastating as the physical effects on their troops. Lieutenant Koji Tanaka survived the bombardment of January 10, 1943, but something in him did not survive intact. He filed his after-action report to division headquarters 3 days later, and in that document, preserved in captured Japanese records examined by American intelligence officers after the war, you can see a man struggling to explain what should have been impossible. Enemy artillery demonstrates coordination capabilities that exceed theoretical maximums for observed fire control, Tanaka wrote. Multiple battery concentration without adjustment fire suggests either pre-registered positions of exceptional accuracy or fire direction methodology unknown to Imperial Army doctrine. He concluded with a sentence that reveals the depth of his confusion. Request technical intelligence assessment of enemy artillery capabilities, as current understanding appears insufficient for effective counter-battery operations. The technical assessment never came. There was no technical intelligence team who could explain what Tanaka had witnessed, because the Japanese army had no institutional framework for understanding centralized fire direction on the scale the Americans were employing. When Tanaka's report reached artillery specialists at 17th Army Headquarters in Rabaul, they filed it alongside dozens of similar reports from Guadalcanal, all describing the same phenomenon, none offering explanation. What the Japanese High Command could not grasp was that they were not fighting an innovation but a system. American artillery superiority was not the result of a secret weapon or a clever and tactical trick. It was the cumulative effect of decades of institutional development, supported by an industrial base that could produce the maps, radios, ammunition, and trained specialists needed to make the system function. You could not copy American artillery tactics without copying American industry, American education systems, American logistics, and American institutional culture. Japanese artillery officers tried. In reports from Bougainville, New Georgia, and later from the Philippines, you can trace their attempts to adapt. Some Japanese batteries attempted to pre-register multiple defensive fire positions, hoping to achieve faster response times. But pre-registration required abundant ammunition for registration fire, accurate maps that often did not exist, and survey equipment that was in short supply. Most critically, it required time and security that Japanese units, constantly on the defensive after mid-1943, simply did not have. Other Japanese commanders attempted to disperse their artillery more widely, hoping that spreading out gun positions would make American fire direction less effective. This reduced the devastating impact of time-on-target fire, but it also reduced Japanese artillery effectiveness. Dispersed batteries could not coordinate their fires. They could not mass their limited firepower on critical targets. The attempted solution to American artillery superiority made Japanese artillery even less effective than it had been. By late 1943, Japanese artillery doctrine had evolved in a direction that revealed the depth of American advantage. Japanese artillery units were instructed to avoid counter-battery fire against American positions. The reasoning was grimly practical. Engaging American artillery invited devastating response fires that Japanese batteries, with their limited ammunition and inferior fire direction, could not hope to survive. Better to conserve shells for supporting infantry and accept that American artillery would operate with near impunity. This was not cowardice. This was calculation. Japanese artillery officers, trained in a doctrine that emphasized careful aim and methodical fire, had concluded that their entire system was obsolete when facing an enemy who could coordinate dozens of batteries through radio networks and fire direction centers. The impossible thing Tanaka had witnessed in January had become routine by December. American artillery could do things Japanese artillery could not counter, and there was no technical or tactical solution available within Japan's industrial and institutional constraints. The psychological weight of this realization fell hardest on men like Tanaka, officers who understood enough about artillery science to recognize the scope of the gap. They were fighting with tools designed for a different war against an enemy who had fundamentally reimagined what artillery could accomplish. The artillery gap that Lieutenant Tanaka first witnessed on Guadalcanal metastasized across the Pacific theater into a crisis that undermined Japanese defensive doctrine at every level. What began as a tactical advantage in American hands became an operational multiplier that shaped the outcome of every major engagement from mid-1943 onward. Consider the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943. Japanese commanders had built elaborate defensive positions, carefully sighted artillery to cover the beaches, and positioned their guns to inflict maximum casualties on American landing forces. The defensive plan was sound by traditional standards, but American naval gunfire and artillery, coordinated through the same fire direction principles that had devastated Japanese positions on Guadalcanal, destroyed Japanese gun positions before they could execute their defensive fires. Japanese artillery observers reported American ships firing coordinated salvos from multiple vessels, concentrating fire on single positions with devastating accuracy. The concept of time on target, developed for land artillery, had been adapted for naval gunfire support. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese artillery faced an even more sophisticated American fire support system. American artillery battalions ashore coordinated their fires not just with other artillery units, but with naval gunfire and with close air support. A Japanese counterattack on June 16th, carefully planned and supported by the concentrated fires of multiple artillery batteries, was shattered before it reached American lines. Forward observers called in fire missions, and within minutes, American artillery, naval guns, and aircraft struck Japanese assembly areas simultaneously. Japanese after-action reports, captured after the battle, described soldiers being killed by artillery fire before they even left their assembly positions, and counterattack units disintegrating under bombardment during their approach march. The mathematics of this disparity were brutal. American artillery battalions in the Pacific typically had 72 guns in direct support of a single division, with additional artillery available from Corps and Army assets. These battalions could sustain rates of fire that consumed hundreds of rounds per gun per day. Japanese divisions, by contrast, typically had 36 artillery pieces, often less after attrition, and ammunition constraints limited them to a few dozen rounds per gun per day in sustained operations. But the quantitative advantage was less important than the qualitative difference in how that artillery was employed. American artillery functioned as a coordinated system. Japanese artillery functioned as individual batteries. An American division could mass the fires of all its artillery, plus supporting units, on a single target within minutes. A Japanese division could not coordinate its batteries to achieve similar concentration. American artillery observers could call for and receive fire support within 5 minutes. Japanese infantry commanders might wait 30 minutes or longer for artillery support, and that support would come from a single battery rather than massed fires. The effect on Japanese defensive doctrine was profound. Traditional defensive tactics assumed that defenders, fighting from prepared positions, enjoyed advantages over attackers crossing open ground. Artillery was meant to reinforce that advantage by breaking up enemy formations before they reached defensive lines. But American artillery reversed that calculus. Japanese defenders in bunkers and fighting positions found themselves subjected to bombardments that exceeded anything in their tactical planning. American infantry advanced behind walls of artillery fire that suppressed Japanese positions before the defenders could effectively engage the attackers. Japanese commanders adapted where they could. They moved to deeper, more dispersed defensive positions. They emphasized night attacks when American fire direction was less effective. They attempted to close with American forces quickly, getting inside the minimum range of American artillery. These were all sound tactical adjustments, but they represented defensive reactions to American artillery dominance. Japanese forces were no longer fighting according to their own doctrine, but responding to an enemy capability they could not match. Perhaps most significantly, the artillery gap contributed to the collapse of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive offensive action, but offensive operations required artillery support to suppress enemy positions and cover advancing troops. Japanese artillery could not provide that support against an enemy whose counter-battery fire was faster, more accurate, and overwhelmingly more powerful. By late 1944, Japanese forces in the Pacific had effectively abandoned offensive operations in favor of defensive warfare, not because their infantry lacked fighting spirit, but because their artillery could not support offensive action against American firepower. The thing Tanaka had seen at Guadalcanal had become the defining characteristic of Pacific combat. The American fire direction system that so bewildered Lieutenant Koji Tanaka and thousands of other Japanese artillery officers was not classified technology. The principles were published in American field manuals. The Fort Sill Artillery School's techniques were taught openly to Allied officers. After the war, these methods would be adopted by armies around the world and would form the foundation of modern artillery doctrine. There was nothing secret about fire direction centers or time-on-target tactics. What the Japanese lacked was not knowledge, but capacity. Building an artillery system like America's required more than understanding the principles. It required an industrial base that could produce radios in quantities that allowed every battery to have radio communication. It required an education system that could train the specialists needed to run fire direction centers. It required a logistics system that could deliver ammunition by the thousands of tons to forward positions. It required an institutional military culture that treated artillery as a science, invested in technical training, and valued systematic coordination over individual initiative. Japan in 1943 possessed none of these prerequisites in sufficient quantity. The nation's industrial capacity was strained, producing aircraft and naval vessels. Its education system, while producing capable officers, could not match the scale of American technical training programs. Its logistics system, dependent on merchant shipping that American submarines were systematically destroying, could barely keep frontline units supplied with basic necessities, let alone the mountains of ammunition American-style artillery tactics required. The gap Tanaka witnessed was not fundamentally a gap in artillery technology. It was a gap in industrial modernity, in institutional capacity, in the ability to mobilize resources on a continental scale. American artillery was superior because American society was organized in ways that supported that superiority. The fire direction centers, the survey teams, the weather specialists, the radio networks, the ammunition production, the training schools, all of these were expressions of a society that had industrialized differently, educated differently, organized differently than Japan. Japanese military planners in the 1930s had recognized these disparities. They had calculated that Japan could not match American industrial capacity in a prolonged war. Their strategy had gambled on delivering rapid knockout blows, securing resource zones, and forcing a negotiated settlement before American industrial power could be fully mobilized. That strategy had failed. By the time Tanaka filed his confused report from Guadalcanal, Japan was fighting exactly the kind of prolonged industrial war it had hoped to avoid. The cost of that failure was measured in more than casualties, though those were horrific enough. It was measured in the progressive collapse of Japanese offensive capability, in the withdrawal to purely defensive operations, in the abandonment of positions that could not be held against American firepower, in the final desperate decision to expend soldiers in suicide attacks because conventional tactics had become impossible. Lieutenant Tanaka's confusion that morning in January 1943 was the confusion of a man trained in one century's way of war confronting another century's industrial reality. He had studied artillery as a craft, learned to calculate firing data manually, mastered the patient art of adjusting rounds onto targets through observed fire. He found himself facing an enemy who treated artillery as an industrial process, who calculated firing data through centralized systems, who could destroy targets without the patient adjustments Tanaka had been taught were necessary. His report, filed with careful professional language, documented the moment when belief met reality. The Japanese artillery doctrine he had learned at Chiba, the doctrine that had served adequately in China and in the early Pacific campaigns, was not wrong in any absolute sense. It was simply insufficient for the war Japan was now fighting. And there was no institutional mechanism, no industrial capacity, no educational system, no logistics infrastructure that could close that gap. That morning on Guadalcanal, watching an entire ridgeline explode without warning, Tanaka had witnessed something that seemed impossible. It was not impossible. It was simply American. And that made it more devastating than any impossible thing could ever be, because it meant that what Japan faced was not a trick or a tactic, but a fundamental disparity in how modern industrial societies could organize violence. The shells fell without warning then. They fall without warning still, in modern armies around the world, because the system Tanaka could not understand became the foundation of artillery practice everywhere. His confusion became history. The impossible became routine. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.